The text becomes shorter. The warmth fades out of the voice. The explanations, the long, careful, patient explanations, stop coming. And one day, dust, you reach for the person who once read your emotional state from across a room, who felt the weight of your silence before you understood it yourself, who stayed when staying was the hardest possible thing to do, and they are simply not there, not gone in the obvious way, still physically present, still capable of eye contact, of conversation, of all the surface forms of connection. But something fundamental has changed. The depth you once had access to has closed off. The warmth that once radiated toward you has been redirected, or perhaps simply switched off. And you cannot reach them. Not with apology, not with explanation, not with the emotional performance you know used to move them. They have become, in the most precise sense of the word, unreachable. Most people who encounter this moment interpret it as abandonment. Some interpret it as cruelty. They believe the empath has chosen whom to punish them, has decided, in some cold and deliberate way, to withhold what was once freely given. They reach harder, they explain more, they perform hurt, then anger, then need. And the empath watches, not with satisfaction, not with coldness, but with something that looks, from the outside, very much like both. What is actually happening is not abandonment. It is not cruelty. It is not even a decision in the ordinary sense of that word. What is happening is the completion of an adaptation that took years to build, years to approach, and perhaps a single moment to complete. The empath who has become unreachable is not someone who stopped caring. They are someone who cared so precisely, for so long, that their nervous system made a structural change, and that change cannot simply be reversed by wanting it to be. The question is, what is the mechanism? What actually happens, neurologically and psychologically, in the person who once felt everything when they finally reach the point where feeling everything becomes structurally unsustainable? And why does the person on the other side almost never understand what they are watching until the door is already closed? To understand the mechanism, you have to understand what an empath actually is, not the popular version, but the documented biological reality. Because the popular version gets this almost completely wrong. And the misconception about what empaths are is exactly why the people who love them are always shocked by what happens when the limit is reached. The brain of a highly empathic person is not simply more sensitive in some abstract, spiritual sense. Neuroimaging research has documented a specific pattern of activity in highly empathic individuals. The mirror neuron system fires more strongly. The insula activates with greater intensity. The anterior cingulate cortex, the region that processes both physical pain and social rejection, responds to others' distress in ways that generate genuine physiological responses in the observer. When a highly empathic person witnesses suffering, their nervous system does not simply register the information. It mirrors it. The suffering is, in a measurable biological sense, felt. This is not a gift. It is a load-bearing structure with a weight limit. The popular narrative about empaths treats this capacity as inexhaustible, as a kind of superpower that makes the empath uniquely positioned to give, to heal, to stay, to understand. What the narrative consistently ignores is the cost structure. Every moment of mirrored emotional experience requires metabolic resources. Every sustained empathic engagement activates the stress response system, the HPA axis, the sympathetic nervous system, elevated cortisol, neural fatigue. The empath who is engaged in sustained intensive emotional labor is running the equivalent of a continuous stress response for hours, days, weeks, sometimes years at a time. Compassion fatigue, documented extensively in clinical psychology, first studied rigorously in emergency responders and healthcare workers, is what happens when this system is asked to operate without adequate recovery. The research consistently shows that chronic empathic engagement without sufficient emotional return produces a specific degradation in the capacity for attunement. The person does not simply become tired, they become altered. The neural pathways that made empathic connection feel rewarding begin to produce a different signal, something closer to warning than invitation. But this is only the beginning of the mechanism. The fatigue itself does not produce the unreachability. Something else does. Just. To understand the next layer, you have to understand what happens when the empathic person's capacity for pattern recognition collides with the accumulated evidence of their emotional environment. Because the same neuroarchitecture that makes the empath extraordinarily sensitive to others' emotional states also makes them extraordinarily sensitive to patterns. And patterns, once recognized, cannot be unrecognized. The brain's threat detection system, centered in the amygdala, is continuously learning. Every experience of emotional investment that produces injury, every time the empath gave and was depleted, every time they tried to be understood and were met with dismissal, every time they stayed when leaving would have been protective, adds a data point to the system's ongoing assessment. The amygdala is not calculating consciously. It is not making decisions. It is building a model. And eventually, that model reaches a conclusion. Not a conclusion the empath chooses, a conclusion the nervous system imposes. The prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive region responsible for long-term thinking, emotional regulation, and the override of instinctive response begins to engage in a way it never needed to before. Where the empath once felt and then processed, they begin to process and then feel. Or more precisely, they begin to process and then decide whether to feel. The gate that was once always open begins to close, not from the outside, but from the inside, not as punishment, as protection. This is the transition most people around the empath never notice, because from the outside, the empath looks the same. They are still present, still engaged, still capable of warmth and attention, and the surface forms of connection. What has changed is the architecture. The automatic mirroring that once happened without deliberation is now conditional. The empath is watching, and what they see increasingly is the pattern. The pattern is rarely dramatic. It is almost never a single betrayal, a single moment of cruelty, a single event that can be named and pointed to as the cause. The pattern is usually quieter than that. It is the person who reaches out in crisis but disappears in the empaths. It is the explanation that is met with defensiveness, then reframed as the empath's fault. It is the gratitude that arrives inconsistently, proportional not to what was given, but to what is needed next. It is the cycle of rupture and repair that always follows the same sequence, in which the empath always ends up performing more of the emotional labor of repair than the other person does. The empath sees this. They have always seen it. But for a long time, sometimes for years, they hold the pattern at a distance. They offer it the benefit of the doubt. They give the other person alternative explanations. They absorb what they absorb and continue. Because the alternative, naming what they see clearly, following the pattern to its conclusion, requires a courage that costs something. And the empath who feels deeply also loves deeply. And love, when it is genuine, is not easily converted into clarity about the one who holds it. But the nervous system does not stop collecting data while the heart is making allowances. There is a specific dynamic in clinical psychology that describes what happens when a person who is highly attuned to others' emotional needs is in sustained contact with someone who chronically fails to reciprocate. The pattern involves a gradual, often unconscious reorientation of the empath's emotional attention from the other person outward to themselves inward. not narcissistically, not selfishly, protectively. The person who is giving everything away begins to reclaim it, not because they decided to, but because the system designed for equilibrium has reached its limit and is attempting to restore balance on its own terms. This reintegration is invisible from the outside. The empath does not announce it. They often do not consciously recognize it. They simply begin to notice that things they once explained now seem obvious. Behaviors they once forgave now register differently. Words that once produced raw hurt now produce something quieter and more complicated. Something that is not quite indifference, but is no longer the open pain it used to be. The pain is still there. The empath feels it. But they are feeling it from a different position, one that includes just, for the first time, a complete view of the pattern it belongs to. And once you can see the full pattern, you cannot choose to unsee it. This is the moment that most people around the empath completely misread, because the empath has just experienced something that feels internally like profound clarity, and what they produce externally is what looks from the outside like distance, like coldness, like the beginning of abandonment. The people who relied on the empath's warmth see the temperature change and interpret it as withdrawal. What they are actually watching is the empath arriving somewhere. The question is where. They have arrived at accuracy. The empath does not become cold. They become accurate. The soft warmth that made every difficult conversation survivable, that cushioned every piece of hard truth, that absorbed every overflow of the other person's emotional excess. That warmth has not disappeared. It has been calibrated. What was once given automatically is now measured, not cruelly, precisely. The empath who has arrived at accuracy gives exactly what the situation warrants, not more, not the extra, the buffer, the cushion, just. The insurance layer of warmth that kept the other person comfortable in the presence of their own patterns. That is what has disappeared. And for some people, the ones who needed that buffer, the loss of it feels like the loss of everything. Here is the part that almost no one talks about, and the part that explains why the empath's eventual unreachability is so disorienting to the people around them. The empath's silence is not the absence of feeling. It is the most complete expression of it. The person who has reached this threshold sees everything. They see the dynamic that produced the situation. They see what the other person is still not saying. They see what the apology is actually trying to accomplish and what it is deliberately leaving out. They see the full history of the pattern living inside this current moment's performance of remorse. They feel all of this. They feel it with a precision that is, in a specific sense, the most developed form of their capacity, the form that emerges only after years of practice and accumulated understanding. They have simply stopped sharing what they see. This is not cruelty. It is exhaustion of a very particular kind, not the fatigue of not caring, but the fatigue of having cared so accurately for so long that sharing the accuracy has become its own form of harm. Not to the other person, to the empath. Because sharing what you see, just when you are certain it will not be received, costs something. It costs the integrity of your own clarity. Every time you explain what you understand to someone who will reframe your explanation as an attack, you erode your own relationship to the truth you hold. And the empath, who has built their entire life on precision of feeling, cannot afford that erosion. So they stop explaining. Not because they have given up, because they have finally completely understood. Just. The relationship between explanation and silence in an empath's withdrawal is one of the most misunderstood dynamics in personal relationships. The people who lose an empath to this threshold almost universally remember the silence as the problem. They point to it as evidence of the empath's cruelty, their coldness, their refusal to engage. What they rarely acknowledge, what they often genuinely cannot see, is the duration and intensity of the explanations that preceded the silence. The empath explained, at length with depth, with patience that was at times structurally unreasonable. They mapped the dynamic in detail. They named what they felt, what they needed, what was missing, what was costing them. They offered the conversation, the understanding, the roadmap. Multiple times, over what was often years. The silence that eventually came was not the absence of an attempt to be understood. It was the conclusion of one. And this is the hardest part of the mechanism to fully grasp, because it requires holding two things simultaneously. The empath's silence looks like giving up, and it is the opposite. The empath who has gone quiet has not given up on the relationship. They have given up on something more specific. They have given up on the belief that the relationship can become something it has consistently demonstrated it cannot be. That is not failure. That is the completion of a very long and very honest process of learning. The nervous system, when it reaches this threshold, does not produce dramatic emotion. The empath does not have a final explosion, a definitive confrontation, a moment that can be pointed to afterward as the obvious turning point. Instead, just what people who have been through this consistently describe is something much quieter, a moment where the weight simply lifts, not into relief exactly, into stillness. The exhausting effort of holding hope in place against the evidence finally ends, not because a decision was made to end it, because the nervous system ran out of the resources required to sustain it. Polyvagal theory, developed by neuroscientist Stephen Porges, describes the nervous system's movement through distinct states, from social engagement to mobilization to shutdown. The empath who has been in sustained, unreciprocated emotional engagement has been operating in a state of chronic mobilization, always ready to engage, always prepared to give, always managing the physiological cost of caring deeply about someone whose capacity to receive that care has been limited. When the nervous system moves out of mobilization and into the more withdrawn state Porges describes as dorsal shutdown, the external presentation is exactly what the empath people describe as unreachability, not aggression, not dramatic withdrawal. Simply a reduction in the energy available for engagement. The lights are dimmer, not off, dimmer. And the crucial thing about this state is that it is not reversible by the ordinary mechanisms. An apology does not restart the social engagement system that shut down gradually over years. An explanation does not immediately restore the neural pathways that rerouted themselves as protection. The empath may hear the apology. They may even believe it. But the body that was built for connection and ran that connection at full capacity for years, that body has learned something. It has learned that full engagement in this specific relational environment produces damage. And the body is slower to unlearn that lesson than the mind is willing to admit. This is why so many people who finally understand what they did, who finally see the empath's experience clearly, who come to the conversation with genuine recognition and genuine remorse, find that it is too late. Not because the empath decided to close the door permanently, but because the door is no longer operated by decision. It is operated by the accumulated weight of documented experience, and that weight has already made its determination. There is a quality that people consistently describe in the empath who has reached this threshold, a quality that is difficult to name precisely, but that is once named immediately recognizable. It is a kind of presence that is no longer seeking. The empath who once leaned toward the people they loved, who oriented toward them, who monitored the shifts in their emotional landscape, who felt the faint early signals of change before the other person was conscious of them, that empath has shifted their orientation. They are still present, but the lean is gone. They are standing in themselves, looking outward with a clarity that has no particular destination. They are not waiting for anything. They are not hoping for anything. And the absence of that waiting, that hoping, that reaching, that is what registers as unreachability. Because for the people around them, the empath's hope was structural. It was the thing that made the relationship feel safe. Not safety in the sense of security, but safety in the sense of always having someone who was working toward the connection, who believed in the possibility, who would not stop before the other person did. The hope was the net, and now the net is gone. What remains is something real but different. Not coldness, something more complicated than coldness. An empath who has reached this threshold is often described by the people who know them well as having become more themselves, not less, more precise, more decisive, more capable of recognizing their own needs and less willing to erase those needs in service of another person's comfort. This is not cruelty, just. This is what happens when a person who spent years organized around another person's emotional life is forced, by the limit of what their nervous system could sustain, to reorganize around their own. The people who lost them often experience this reorganization as the most painful part, because the empath who reorganized around themselves is, in many ways, more vital, more clear, more fully present than they were inside the relationship. They did not diminish. They expanded into the space the relationship had been occupying, and this expansion, this evidence that the empath is not broken, is not devastated, is functioning at a level that seems incompatible with the grief the other person is experiencing, is the thing that makes the loss feel most complete. Because it means the empath was giving something the other person never fully understood was being given. Something that cost everything to produce. Something that, once redirected, produced a version of the empath the relationship never got to see. What the empath carries forward from this moment is not damage in the simple sense. The research on resilience after relational harm consistently shows that people who have been through this process, overinvestment, depletion, the completion of the pattern, the reorganization, often develop a more sophisticated emotional intelligence than they had before. Not because suffering is a teacher in some abstract sense, but because the specific experience of having given enormously and learned precisely what that giving produced, and then integrated that knowledge into a new operating structure, that process changes the quality of attention the person is capable of. They become harder to manipulate, not because they stop feeling, because they feel with accuracy. They recognize the early signals. They notice the pattern forming before it completes. They trust the data of their own experience. They are no longer as easy to reach, but that is not the same as unreachable. It is being selectively available. Available to what actually warrants it. And this discrimination, this capacity to feel deeply and choose precisely, is the end product of the process that looked, from the outside, like withdrawal, like the empath giving up on the very thing they were built for. What they actually gave up was something much more specific. They gave up the belief that their depth was something any environment deserved, that any relationship which asked for it was entitled to receive it in full. They kept the capacity. They moved the threshold. The person who becomes emotionally unreachable to the people who depleted them is often, simultaneously, deeply available to the people who enter their life afterward. People who do not require the empath to cushion their own reality in order to be loved. People who ask for the empath's depth and offer something proportional in return. For those people, the empath is not unreachable at all. They are more present than they have ever been because they are no longer spending the energy of their presence on sustaining hope against evidence. This is the thing worth understanding. This is the thing that changes what the empath's silence actually means. The person who became unreachable did not close a door. They realized, after years of sustained and careful attention, that the door they had been holding open was not a door the other person ever intended to walk through. They had been holding it open against the weight of evidence because they believed in the possibility on the other side. And when the belief was finally exhausted, not as a collapse, but as the natural completion of a long process of honest reckoning, they let the door close, not to lock someone out, to stop holding themselves in the gap. The people who lose an empath to this threshold will often spend a long time waiting for the warmth to return. Waiting for the person who once gave them access to a depth they could not produce themselves to come back to the door they left. Some of them will understand, in time, what they were given and what it cost. Just. A smaller number will understand it in time to do something useful with that understanding. And the rest will continue to experience the empath's silence as abandonment, without ever fully arriving at the recognition that the silence was preceded by years of invitations they never understood were invitations at all. The empath does not leave loudly, they leave completely. And what remains, the clarity, the stillness, the precise and measured version of themselves that the threshold produced, is both the consequence of everything that was given and the evidence that the giving was real. Not a wound, a formation. The thing they became because of what they chose to feel and how long they chose to feel it, and what they finally understood when the feeling was given every possible chance to be met and was not. The silence is not the end of their capacity. It is the beginning of their precision. And what they build in that precision, who they let in, what they offer, how they move through a world they now understand in a way they could not before. That is the next part of this. If you recognize what was just described from inside it or from the other side of it, that next video is worth watching before you decide what to do with what you now know.